Well, hi everyone, and welcome to, and I still haven't found what I'm looking for. This is a session on, I'll move my Zoom stuff around, the evolution of search from keywords to AI. And there's a bunch of steps in between, some of which I'm going to skip because it's impossible to keep up with changing technologies. Let me take you back to the beginning for me, at least. I was a teenager growing up, building computers in my family's living room, the computer room. And I remember when we first got the internet, it felt like magic. Suddenly, our house was connected to this exciting, massive digital world. And here's the problem: I didn't know how to find anything, and there wasn't really a good way to do it. It was this powerful tool, but without any way to navigate it. And it's like being dropped in this big 8-lane highway with no signs and no instructions. So, search wasn't just an essential tool, but it became foundational to how we perceive and interact with the internet, just searching to find pages. And then once you get a user, how do you find your way around? Back then, search was simple. You type in a word or two and you hope something useful showed up. And maybe it was on page one. Awesome. Or page seven, you'd probably just started to give up. In fact, I remember it being kind of fun to see like the Google letters expand. How many pages? Wow, that's actually daunting now. No one's going to look that far. Search has changed. Today, we expect to get a lot more value out of a search tool, and I think users are starting to understand how to like game the system, but that's unfortunate because we want it to be intuitive and easy. We want to connect the dots for people. We want to personalize answers, and when we're lucky, even anticipate what they're going to type in. And that shift from finding keywords to something bigger where you understand intent is what we're going to explore today. We'll look at how search has evolved because even the early technology is still valid. And we're going to talk about how you can choose the right approach for your site because we don't often, tech leads, get a chance to think, what am I doing? You just end up opting into the technology in front of you. So let's demystify them a little today and maybe just give everyone enough of a working vocabulary to explore these topics more, because any single one of these is a conference talk in and of itself. Quick introduction. I'm Jim Vomero. I am a engineering manager at Four Kitchens, and I use digital platforms for all my nerdy hobbies, from calculating homebrew beer recipes to sharing vacation photos to teaching kids how to survive the zombie apocalypse at Philadelphia area summer camps. Yeah, I have websites for all kinds of things. And I'm always excited to keep this conversation going. So our contact information is on this slide. And with me is Edwin. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Yeah, my name is Edwin Torres. I am backend engineer. I was working in many sites. I I took some course in Drupal course maybe 2 years ago. So I am happy to share my knowledge for this session.
Awesome. As far as today's sessions go, we're going to review some of those technologies. In particular, we're going to talk about keyword searching, document searching, and vector searching. Those will be our three bigger topics. And this is not an advanced engineering session by any way, but we will try to introduce each one of these in some sort of interesting way. And instead of looking at a lot of code, we're going to talk about the concepts of what make these technologies work, where they shine, what their trade-offs and costs are. And we'll try to keep the technical bits approachable while still digging into them. So everyone here hopefully walks away with something actionable. And to tee it up, Edwin, if you'd like to take it away, let's start at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, why is it so important the search engine in all the sites? Sometimes we have a lot of pages in our site, we have a lot of information. Sorry, we have a lot of data in this site, but how to get that data for information? Because data is the true values, the collection of a lot of uh, numbers, but the decision take with information. And when our customer wants to get information, needs a right engine for search. Because it's like if you have a lot of books in a room, if this book is not classified or this book is messy, you can get the information, the right information. So in our site, we can have a great data, But if your customer don't get the information, this is not valuable. So to choose the right engine search is important because this is the price, this is the how fast is to get the information, because sometimes it's frustrating that you are looking for something and you can find this information. So the search engine help us to get the right information.
I like how
We
you
have,
talked about, you made an analogy about a room of books because libraries do have detailed classification systems, but it's not necessarily the easiest way to find information. You're just finding a reference, right? Finding a book is not the same thing as finding your answer. And so, yeah, this first use case of a basic text search is sort of that. You could find where information's being held, but that doesn't mean it has your answer.
yeah, and in this section we try to show you what kind of information search engine are available, and you can choose the best for your needs. So we are talking about the first approach is very simple method, is a basic text search. Um, could you go to the
Oh,
next
yes,
slide,
I can.
please? Thank you. So, for example, the sentence like is very powerful because we can uh, find some words in a database, but is the site is big, the database, the result of the search is not so fast. Is maybe could be slow, and this search could be affect the performance of the site, because you are searching for some words in a big database, the performance is affected. So in this case, it's very useful when the site is is small. Uh, there are a few tables in your database, and you need to find a specific word, because you only have when you use this sentence, the word is exactly that you are finding. So you can use um, a verb with no conjugation, for example, is not. It's only for a specific. So it's very easy to create a search because it's one line of the code, but there are some limits. This is the first approach. The next one.
Well, I want to mention this is actually a real example. So even though it might seem obvious, you can search with a database like, don't discount it. Yeah, the performance is horrible, but there's cases where that doesn't matter. And so this sample on the screen is a version of something I wrote very recently where we just wanted an autocomplete field. Prospective students looking for a program, they start typing the name of the program, and there it is. But on the same note, we realized people were searching for other terms. So instead of computer science as the official degree conferred, they might search programming or informatics or software engineering. So we decided we're going to search two terms, the programming and a synonyms field. But I don't care that the performance is bad because this is not a place where that is going to impact the user flow. In fact, the fact that this code is so simple is a win for us on this project.
Well, what is the strange? It's very cheap, it's easy to implement, and it's fast to implement. In a small site, this approach work very good. Um, if your site is small and your information, your database is no many tables, you can use this approach. The limit is you can only match of literal string. You can only, if you are looking for a word, this word needs to be specific all the time. You can do a another related word, for example. The performance is not the best because if many people is searching for information, the performance in the site could be decreased because the search. When we can use that approach when there are a limit number of texts, the database is not big, and when the ranking is not important in this approach.
I like that you did the programmer thing and numbered this approach as 0. Got to start 0 index, but also because it's not really a search index, but this one is.
Yeah. Next, we can use you can add some index tables to specific words. This index help you to match in more fast than the simple like sentence. For some complex pages, it's very great because the index is fast that the other approach, um, and the result is better than the simple like sentence. For example, we can create this table by index, and you organize the information by this index. So we can get better result in the search.
Yeah, this is a actual snapshot from a WordPress site where that we just loaded with a few blog posts using the relevancy module. But a lot of CMSs, especially PHP-based ones, are going to have some version of this. They'll talk about it as tokens, but just breaking a page down to a series of words and doing that exact lookup. So it's kind of the opposite of an index in the back of a book. It has all the lists of every word in your site and tells you which page to find that word on. So it's a reverse lookup in a way. It still does, though, that literal issue you were talking about, Edwin. I mean, if someone searches computer sciences, it's not going to find computer science necessarily, but it's going to do it a lot faster.
Yeah. The strength of this approach, the performance is really great because you don't search in the whole database. You only search for the index, so it's more fast. The performance is not affected like the first approach. You can use some keywords inside of static words, specific words, for example, and you can match for a more result than the first approach. You can have relevance, for example, depend on the result. Some contents are more important than others, so you can handle this relevance in the keywords too. This approach is used in some content managing system. For example, WordPress is very easy to configure this approach. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, Drupal as well. I think some of the more modern cloud-based ones don't, because they're almost expecting you to use an external provider or a third-party engine. Um, but sometimes that's not the right fit for the job. And I would venture to say that if you're on a site with hundreds of pages, you can make a keyword search advantageous. And using your example, you can add some weight. So maybe a keyword in a title is worth more than a keyword in the body. Or maybe there's a keyword metadata field that can have a multiplier. It's still not a smart search, but it might be the right tool for the job. And it's usually pretty free for a lot of our open source softwares.
Mhm. And you can you don't need to. uh, create a custom configuration or install a external server to this work inside the CMS.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of my biggest thoughts as I started to prepare for my part of this talk is at the start of a project, I don't always have a minute to think, what search tool am I going to use? And yeah, that I think you just hit it. What's the line here? If I don't want to support an external system, whether I'm hosting it or not, there is nothing wrong with a keyword-based search. It can be a useful tool as long as you can explain clearly what the limits are. But let's assume we're going somewhere else. Let's talk document indexing. So at this point, maybe you've adopted keyword indexing in your search results. They're fast, they're flexible, but something still feels off. I usually get to a point where users are complaining about irrelevant results or that things just don't show up in the right spots. They would expect a page to be number one and it's on page four. You might even be at the point where it's just so hard to reindex your site because you have millions of rows in your search index. That's a lot. That's a lot to search, even for a fast search. This is the time to think of going from keyword indexing to something more like indexing the entire document itself. I did put together some slides with images. If we have time at the end, though, I have this site available and we can click on it together and look at all the things. But I took a couple of screenshots of some highlights. So some examples of document tools that you may have used on past projects. Solar, that's pretty powerful in a lot of the spaces in higher ed. Elasticsearch is another competitor. And there's other ones like this. Many of them have a self-hosted or a cloud-based version of it. And in these, you need to figure out how to take your, I'm going to say web page. That's a loaded statement anymore. What is a page? And turn it into something that's going to be indexed. You're usually looking at fields or how parts of that page are rendered. This becomes essential when you have complicated search or complicated content types or data models, because we're not going to be able to build a web page efficiently with hundreds of queries just to create a search index. You have your fields, but your fields contain objects. Those objects contain fields. Sometimes the references go hundreds of levels deep and you're into all these joins. So the document search is creating a set of rules for how possibly every field on your page influences the indexing of the entire page, the document. And so this puts us in a place that rather than searching for individual terms on a page because we concatenated all the text, we're going to look for overall relevance of the documents by checking each of those fields. One of the other benefits of using a tool like this is they're much more flexible. So in my example here, this was a Drupal site I just spun up using their default search API, is I was able to take my locally hosted, this is still locally hosted, I didn't turn on Solar, a locally hosted server and add 3 search indexes. That was very easy to copy and paste them. I created one search for content. I have almost everything in there. I think I left the resources content type out. I have another search index as a directory. So if you're in the people, organization, or facility content type, that's a separate index that we're going to put on one of our service pages. And then I have a third search index for events. And that's not one we actually have people searching for regularly, but we're dynamically pulling in content. So being able to use your search index is like a recommendation engine that's now unlocked because we're not just searching for keywords. We can have all kinds of fun with the algorithm. As you go into any one of these search indexes, you can start opting things in and out. And so this is something that will be very common in these technologies where you can say, I want these types of documents or content types or post types, whatever your system calls, to be included or excluded. Both those logics are sound. You can also start to make the decision, do I want the raw data from the database or do I want some sort of level of filtering, often on a field by field level? So I'm going to index the whole rendered page, run those joins, run those queries. We're going to do that asynchronously in the back and build the search index up. We can opt in other fields. Like in this case, I have the title of the page set to have a relevance of 8 times. I don't know what that number means. It just, if I set a bunch of things at 1, then the titles times 8. And I could also go down. Maybe I want the author field to be represented, but it's fractional. It's 0.1. So somebody with a keyword-rich name doesn't accidentally wind up in your search results constantly. This lets you really tame what you want to do on a field per field basis. And this sounds like a win. Now you're not just searching for a page because there's a word on it. Awesome. That might just be a frequently asked questions page that has a ton of words on it. That's not very helpful to always put that facts page in the search results. You can tame it and say, okay, there are parts of this page that are more influential than others. The other thing you can do, often on a field by field setting, is start looking at rules of how you can process the content of each one of those fields. These tools, in this case, this one's just a native solution to Drupal, but you'll find this kind of stuff in Solr and Elasticsearch. I'm going to keep naming those two because I use them the most often, but there's so many others. You can do things like check if the user has access to this content, otherwise omit it from the index. Build the search results so it highlights the keywords. So you have an excerpt. That's actually adding a ton of value in search. Add an HTML filter. That's useful if you have some like classes that have some great search index words, and you don't want the div class alert to influence your search results. So we can start filtering some of that stuff away. Ignore case, ignore characters. The stemming is now we're starting to get into some interesting stuff where you can search for what's the example here and here? Talk and talking would give the same search results. So using some very basic natural language algorithms to assemble the sort of document weighting of these. Um, there are entire conference talks on setting up a document search. So I'm just going to summarize what I think about when I'm working on a new site and if this is the right source. Document sources are great because they give you that power keyword index, but they give you nuance and structure and your own business intelligence on top of it. You can start adding weights to each field, boosting important ones. You can finally start doing scoring and ranking. There's some like popular algorithms, IDF and BM25. I don't know what these are. I just know I have to click the button to turn them on. Some data scientists figured out they were a great way to rank relevance to documents. Custom relevancy and tuning is a thing. And also adding sort of awareness, having all of your fields concatenated together and joined together without having to write a bunch of database queries to assemble a page. These tools are great because they have large communities that support them. And so they often have third-party plugins as well for analyzing multilingual sites, for handling synonyms on the fly. That's something you can turn on. Being able to highlight, autocomplete, or add faceted search usually comes with these document tools out of the box. It's not strictly the document pattern, but it's usually bundled in. And they usually act as APIs with support for high volume changes. So if you are in a site that has thousands of pages and users need to regularly traverse those in different ways, you're probably into I need a document search. But this isn't perfect. Let's talk limits and be realistic about it. Um, Document indexing gives you a lot of control, but it comes with a lot of complexity. Tuning your search is tricky. And tweaking all of those things I talked about, I just gave 3 screenshots. There are weights and filters and processors for every possible thing, thousands of options. That's a lot for your development team to work through and come up with like, what are the sensible defaults? It's also a lot to put on your content folks to let them know these fields are weighted differently. Change your content strategy and how you're going to operate to best optimize search. Unless you have dedicated people, these tools might be overkill. You might end up having this expensive document search idea, but never really getting the value out of it that you want. Because a lot of them operate with some sort of algorithm that's a little black box, it's harder to debug. Why is this page ranking higher than that? I can't just do a database query to figure that out all the time. And it's going to probably take longer to do that database indexing as you get into searching and stemming and all the different rules you can add. So it's ideal when you're on larger sites, when you have a very dense document structure, lots of fields coming together, a product catalog or a collection of academic resources or a knowledge base would be a really good one. Anything with an archive, this makes that content finally discoverable again. And this is also where you can turn content conversations into something of product strategy. Because with the right setup, a document search can let you do very nuanced things and drive people to the content that they need and have an enjoyable experience on your site. You just got to make sure you're ready for it.
So
We have one more
something
approach, but anything you
so,
wanted to add, Edwin?
something important is the if you are working in architecture like Pantheon or Akia, this technology have the solar integrated in the architecture. So you only need to configure some fields or something else. But if you are using something like Amazon AWS or Google infrastructure, you need to start a new instance for Solar. So this is another cost of the platform. So you need to pay for that instance. So it's important to take this because the cost at the maintenance is not the same that the other architecture. So if you need something cheap, uh, the other architecture work in better way. But if you can start a new instance in your infrastructure, it's great to do it.
That's a good reminder. Thank you. Yeah. So not only the cost of ownership, like maintaining all of that as a responsibility, but literal costs if you're spinning up new services and having to keep them going and updating
Or
them. What happens when you have to update your application and update your search stack? It's one more thing. Avoid the tech debt. All right, last one. Can you have a conference and not talk about AI? I don't think it's possible, but this one doesn't feel so bolted on. This one is real because search has been very transformative. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped it. I'm thinking ahead. I do have one honorable mention. Graph indexing. Um, Graph indexing is big, but probably not for the tech stacks of the people on this call. So I just wanted to mention it. With graphs, the value comes for how content is connected. They usually talk about nodes and edges. So if you're looking at how the authors of a blog post, and those authors are a member of an organization, and that organization has a bunch of events, and those events have distinguished speakers, and those speakers wrote other blog posts. Everything's interconnected. And having that web of connections is what drives a index that's going to be graph powered. That's sort of the model that we're talking about. So these tools are really important when you say, show me events related to this faculty member's research, or show me all the articles that have these kinds of tags, because that's the kind of user I am. Maybe we infer that based on their browser patterns, or display related people and programs dynamically to make recommendations as someone's on a marketing funnel on a higher ed site. I would say Facebook and other social media companies have been big pioneers in this space. And so they are big technologies, but it only gets one slide in today's session. I think it still serves as a great recommendation that being thoughtful about how your content relates to one another will influence all your searches. So do make good decisions there. But I don't want to go too far into graphs because it's just not too applicable to most people's daily work. That brings me to AI. Now we're there. So at this point, we talked about a bunch of solid search experience. We moved past text matching. That wasn't really search. And we moved into some keyword. Now that is an index, but it's a very literal index. You're looking for a word. We tuned it up to a document, and those tools often have some interesting preprocessors and the ability to find common patterns, like that stemming feature we talked about. But something is still missing. If someone searched for software careers on my site, and we have an article called programming jobs, are they going to find that? They mean the same thing, but that is different. Because really, we want our searches to feel smart, especially if that's the pattern. Not every site has users going in blank, but on most sites, there's at least one general website search where somebody who's lost or unsure where to begin is putting in general things. And what if they search the wrong thing? It's not wrong to them. Or what if they ask a question? Are you prepared for that? Or is that going to pollute sort of your results pool? This is where AI has been transformational. And I just want to talk a little bit about how it works under the hood, because this isn't going away, clearly. This would be a vector database, and there's several kinds of indexes that relate, but I'm going to show it in 2D space. So all of this starts with embeddings, and embeddings is it comes from math. Let's say we're turning our content, some product titles and descriptions, into a set of numbers. The math represents a meaning, but for a model here, it can find things very quickly with numbers as opposed to all the things you need to do to index words. Embeddings is turning language into that number, that vector, and being able to place it somewhere in a database. So in my example, I have a travel website that sells a bunch of products, and I took trail shoes and I made that a vector. And I made hiking boots a vector. Maybe I have an article on that, or I have a product catalog where I'm breaking some of our things down into pieces. I think I have one on boots. Each one of these is a vector, a series of numbers, and I placed it here on the graph. And you can see things near each other are somehow related. So sneakers and what I have trainers and trail shoes are all near each other. They've created a little neighborhood. Now, this is super convenient, but not real. This is a 2D plot. In real life, these vectors often have like 384 dimensions, or I think the one we just built had 1,536 dimensions on every vector. I can't visualize that in any way, but just know that in some way in space, content that is similar is placed in the same neighborhood. So tents and sleeping bags and backpacks might be in a section about gear and setting up overnight camping or backpacking, where camp snacks and foods and maybe related, like camping with kids, is in a different neighborhood based on how that natural language got turned into an embedding. How does that happen? Ask a data scientist. There's some really cool things, but that's the one of the big core offerings of large language models is they all have a way to turn a thought, usually based in text, into a set of numbers. That's the vector, and they're plotted next to each other. And so, how does this work? Someone comes to your site and they type the search hiking footwear. Now, that phrase doesn't exist in any of my content, but that phrase, hiking footwear, is turned into a vector as well. It's plotted on this graph. Let's see, can I move my mouse? I don't know if you'll see it, but it's plotted on this graph somewhere near all of my other vectors that have to do with hiking footwear. And so now we're using, and it's an algorithm in this case called nearest neighbor, to figure out what content is most relevant. In this way, the AI doesn't actually say that this page matches. It's just saying how close in proximity am I to other content and what am I willing to allow? How far am I willing to expand to find the next closest thing? So we find all the vectors that are closest, and then we make some sort of decision. Maybe we rank them as part of a search, or maybe what's becoming more common is you still have your document search, but somewhere else, maybe at the top of search or in some augmented way, there is a set of recommendations. Here's a top listing. Google's been doing this quite a bit. Bing has now been doing it as well, where that little AI block appears somewhere on your site and says, by the way, here's something of interest. Or you can get more results if you do that. Four Kitchens recently did a page for a nonprofit where folks are looking for ways to donate time and money to different nonprofits. So it's a bridge to other nonprofits. And someone may put in very specific criteria where they're looking to donate their time or money. And we're able to use this nearest neighbor idea to say, here's your search results, the one that literally matched what you put in, but here are things that are really close. Would you be willing to, instead of just volunteering on the weekends, would you be willing to do a Friday? Because all of these animal shelters would need help as well. And we know that you enjoy working with animals. So being able to find nearest neighbors and service them somewhere in combination with a traditional search seems to be where things are really shining and taking off. In this case, we're not relying on keywords. It's that closeness and context. And it means a couple other interesting things. For one, all of this is numbers. So I can search for zapatos. And guess what? It's still going to place it in that same area. Multilingual is not even remotely an issue because we're translating to the same thing in general. Um, there's obviously more nuance, but there's no third-party service needed to translate in that regard. It also means that if someone just asks a question, they go off script. I see this all the time when I look at search index search metrics in like a Google Analytics. Someone asks a question, that question is still going to be placed on this graph, and we'll be able to find the nearest neighbor. So we're finding meaning again. And it even opens up this like multimodal thing where someone could take a picture of something, send a picture of something, and if I take a picture of a tent, I'm going to find results that are like tents because there is an algorithm to make a vector out of an image. So that embedding process is very valuable. Long time ago, I remember using Shazam on my phone to I hear a song. What song is this? And identify it. That's all this was doing. Taking an audio sample, turning it into a vector, looking at known vectors in that closest neighborhood. What's in proximity of this pattern I heard. Um, so that's blowing up. I'm loving it. It has a lot of potential. As I mentioned, you could search for car or automobile, get the same thing. So you're back down to meaning. You're going to a place where you can do natural language queries. You don't have to say scholarship application form. Someone could type, how do I apply? And it's still going to get you that same subset of content. That multilingual support has been great, the mixed media search, and that you're really just getting to something smarter than text matching. Vector tools are aplenty. It's hard to keep up, but OpenAI is, of course, one of the ones that have really put themselves out there. So chances are that's one that you can get started with if you want to experiment. They have an embedding API. You send it different kinds of content. It sends you the vector back. Cohere is another one I've used regularly, and there's a ton of models on Hugging Face if you want to check them out. So that's how you get the embedding. Now you need to put it somewhere. The ones I've used, especially for training, is Pinecone. And then that's just been so easy, but not everyone wants to use this proprietary software. So there are some more open source standards. I'm trying to think which ones I even recommend. There are a ton of databases. Quadrant I've really enjoyed, where you can now store these vectors into a database, and these vector databases can do those like proximity searches with some other attributes you can pass along the way. But the best thing I think is to layer this kind of vector search on top of a traditional search and marry them into something else. I should mention, where does this break down? This is the hardest one to debug because who knows? It's math and it's advanced math. It's complicated models. If something seems off, we may not ever know why. And you end up constantly gaming the system. If models change under the hood year over year, you might be back to testing everything again to make sure your search is still operating the way you wanted it to. It requires that embedding process, which generally is not free. It's at least going to take time and compute time. But if you're using a proprietary system, cloud-based service, you're probably paying for that as well. It's harder to keep content fresh because if you edit a page, you have to regenerate those embeddings. The numbers don't automatically update. If you want to know how to do that on the fly, there's a great topic on batches and queues we could talk about tomorrow. And this is the most black box of them all. We don't know what's going on inside there. It's created a whole new discipline of prompt engineering, and people are coming up with new ways to run confidence tests on AI search results. But in no way is this just setting a bunch of config files that you can copy from one project to another and feel confident. This takes a lot of hands-on learning. When's AI a good fit? I think if you plan on doing any other AI related project, this is a very easy way to get started, to take your content and index it in a vector search. It will unlock things like having a chat service or some sort of a recommendation engine, or allow you to just have more open-ended searches so you can influence that like natural language piece of it, even if you don't want to go all in and power your search with it. You can have a better 404 page or something like that. This is not a replacement for those indexing tools. They're still important. So I wouldn't plan on going with AI so you can get rid of your Solar instance because it's been dragging you down. I don't think we're ready for that. And this is also just a huge commitment. So if you're ready for it, this is a magical search tool when it's working. And it's just opening up a whole new chapter to how we think about search from a place of meaning. I'm actually kind of hoping that I don't ever have no longer have to have conversations on taxonomy terms because content will sort of coalesce into its own groups on its own. All
So,
right. So
so
by now we've went through
something,
a bunch. Edwin, yes, by all means.
yeah, something to comparing with solar, for example, with solar you pay for the whole instance running, but in the AI you need to pay for queries. So it's a little more expensive, but so it's important to if the budget allow you, you can do it, but the cost is a little more uh, height than the solar approach, for example.
I've been back and forth on that one. So for a long time, I would take on a new, like, let's say we're doing a revamp on a website, and I'd say, look at this content. It's 15 years old. No one ever looks at it. You don't need this content. Let's thank it and say goodbye. But one thing I've realized, that content that no one's going to update and optimize for like a document search index doesn't need to be optimized for an AI index. So if you could put a few extra dollars towards the technology and save the people cost for that low value content, that might actually even be true of something like a knowledge base that has deep content that's not maintained regularly. If that's a realistic scenario, there might be a fiscal equation you can work out and say, oh no, the AI is worth it because we don't have the people hours to maintain this huge document repository. And I'm kind of leaning on the idea of websites having lots of content being a good thing again because it's great context. But we went through, let's say, four approaches, maybe five, depends on how you counted. And there's no one size fits all for search. Your content, your users, and how your team wants to set up and manage these things is going to take some negotiation. So here's just a few things to keep in mind. Is really a review. How much do you want your content to scale? If it's dozens of items, there is nothing wrong with a basic text search. Or if you're just using search in a very limited way, an autocomplete can totally be a database like. There's nothing wrong with that, just a reminder. But as soon as you get into the hundreds of items, you are probably going to need something that's much more performant. And so that's where you're going to look at a higher level tier. And if you want to get to meaning, well, now we're getting into graphs and hybrid approaches. Also, how important is context versus exact match? This is becoming a bigger thing. Like I said, all the times I spent using taxonomy or automating menus, maybe partly a thing in the past as we're coming up with new tools to discover content, um, new user flows that are AI based. Also, what resources do you have available? Thank you, Edwin, for being the constant reminder because you do a lot of maintenance. So I guess you're thinking about this a lot. Do you really want to have a paid version of Elasticsearch and then have your team constantly updating content in a much more technical way? Maybe, but it is a lot and can be very overwhelming for your team. In fact, I threw that one on the technical barriers part. Um, these are just tougher integrations as you move up through those tools. Some of them have performance issues at scale. AI in particular means you now have to generate those embeddings. If someone is constantly editing content, how often do you want to update that? Do you take one page and make that an embedding? Do you break it apart into a bunch of pieces that you embed? There's actually some really interesting research on that, but that is not this talk. And what do you do with messy data? Uh, for all of these, it's a consideration, but they all have a different take on what messy data can be. In some regards, these simpler search engines, a keyword search, ends up being fine because you just don't have enough time to set up all of your document rules. As organization barriers go, I think I'll sum these up in the same three every project I'm on. There's a level of like stakeholder education because folks expect search to work. They don't often think about these technologies, and especially what does it mean to say be a database manager and think about batch times and queue times and processing times of database tasks. They just kind of expect search to work, and if it's not working great, let's make it better. But these are big commitments, so you sometimes have to slow down and talk about the literal costs with going to that next tier. Folks also get in decision fatigue. And so I have quite a few projects that went with whatever the search tool was out of the box. WordPress has a bunch, install it, I'm good to go. It might not have been the right one, but change just sort of felt unnecessary, and that's been a barrier. And then of course, budget versus value. I can't advocate for something if it doesn't have return on investment. And even if it seems like a great tool, it might not be worth it. So, in conclusion, let's just wrap this up. Search is often overlooked until it's broken, and then everyone wants you to fix it. But when it's done well, it becomes this like invisible way where people can find content effortlessly and fast, and your site becomes helpful. It's like a bridge between what your users want, even if they know about it or not, and what kind of things you've been hosting. So the truth is, search isn't magic, it's just engineering, and you have the power to shape it. I'm hoping this topic, which introduced quite a few things, will help you, especially as you go into technical conversations on discovery, to learn a little bit more about all these tools. Thank you all so much. We're here for questions. We'd love to talk about it. I also have demos of a couple of these things if we want to dig in deeper with anything live.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Edwin. We did get a couple of questions. Andrea, it seems like maybe your question was answered, but I'm not sure if you want to ask it again with some context because it was early in the presentation.
No, I think it was answered.
Okay.
Thank you.
We just got a question from Robert asking, are vectors transferable to different systems, or most likely, are they proprietary to the system that generated it?
Great question. Yes, no, both. In general, I end up rebuilding vectors constantly, even within the same system, because there are too many tools in the sort of like AI orchestration pipeline, and I need them all to align. So I have gone as far as to come up with a new chatbot, and I realized that I'm using an LLM that wants my vectors in a different format. And there it is. I have to rebuild my vectors. Now, luckily, I'm agnostic to what the vectors are. I do not mind having multiple indexes of the same content or rebuilding them because they are a reflection of my actual canonical content. So I don't mind thinking of those vectors themselves as disposable or even having multiple versions. And something I really want to try, I had mentioned that, how you break up a page can matter. So do you index the entire page? These AI tools now have great, token windows. Do you take the entire web page and make that one vector? Well, that could be good, but it deletes the meaning of the individual paragraphs or sections of that page. Do you convert that to plain text? Do you convert that to Markdown? Markdown's been working really well for me. Or do you break it apart by paragraph? Or my personal favorite's been like a sliding window. So I'm going to take 5,000 characters and then the next 5,000 characters, but I'll overlap them 20%. That way I get some meaning from the thing before. What I'd really like to try to do is search against two vector databases of the exact same content using two different strategies to see which one is performing better for my content. So I don't care which tool. I don't care about these vectors maybe being a little disposable. And I would almost expect them to be as things are changing so fast. In the couple of years max that I've been doing AI work, I have switched models so many times for so many reasons. And every time I end up regenerating those vectors.
Something important is you can start in any of these approach and then you can move to another approach. So it's not important to, when you start this project, all the time is the same approach. No, you can start with a approach that the cost is good for you. And then if the budget is better, you can move to another approach.
And Justin, thank you for mentioning the chat. The embedding model matters. Yes, there are combinations of these tools that are going to play nice together. And there are some that are going to be much more proprietary. Any other questions? Because this is fun. I love thinking about search. I love that I don't have to make a search anymore because these tools exist.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. So, last chance.
Well, thank you all so much.
All right.